January 17, 1945, Hürtgen Forest, Western Germany. The snow fell in silence, not the gentle silence of winter peace, but the heavy, oppressive quiet that follows artillery fire. An American combat engineer named James Delaney crouched in a foxhole barely 3 feet deep, his hands numb around the handle of his newly issued folding shovel. The metal was cold, almost burning against his frozen fingers. Around him, the forest stood skeletal, trees shattered into jagged stumps by weeks of bombardment. He had been digging for 20 minutes, and the ground, frozen solid, beneath a thin layer of mud, had yielded perhaps 6 inches of progress. Across the scarred landscape, partially buried in snow and earth, lay the body of a German soldier, his own folding shovel still strapped to his pack, its blade dark with something that wasn't mud. Delaney didn't look too closely. He had heard the stories from the veterans, whispered in the firelight of temporary camps, about what the Germans could do with that simple tool. He had dismissed them as exaggeration, the kind of myth that grows in the soil of war. Now feeling the weight of his own shovel and the resistance of the earth, he wondered if he had misunderstood something fundamental about the enemy he faced. The American M1943 entrenching tool was born from observation and necessity. Throughout 1942 and 1943, as Allied intelligence officers examined captured German equipment, one item appeared again and again in their reports with a frequency that suggested importance beyond its humble appearance. The Klappspaten, Germany's folding shovel, was compact, efficient, and ubiquitous among Wehrmacht forces. American military observers noted its design with the methodical precision that characterized wartime industrial espionage. The blade could be locked at multiple angles. The handle was reinforced steel. The entire tool folded to less than 10 inches, easily carried on a soldier's belt or pack. By late 1943, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps had issued specifications for an American version, believing they were copying a superior engineering solution for battlefield excavation. They measured the angles, replicated the folding mechanism, and distributed hundreds of thousands of them to American troops heading into the European theater. The specifications mentioned durability, portability, and efficiency in creating defensive positions. What they did not mention, what did not appear in any official American documentation, was the German Army's unofficial but widely understood secondary purpose for the tool. The Americans had copied the form with precision, but they had entirely missed the philosophy. The Wehrmacht did not design the Klappspaten merely as a digging implement. They designed it as an instrument of total war, where every object carried by a soldier served multiple purposes, where the line between tool and weapon was deliberately blurred. German military doctrine, forged in the aftermath of the First World War and refined through the brutal campaigns in Poland and Russia, emphasized versatility and psychological warfare. The Klappspaten embodied both, its sharpened edges, its weighted construction, its ability to be locked into a perpendicular angle. These were not accidental features. They were intentional. German soldiers received training, informal but widespread, in using the shovel for close-quarters combat. In the trenches of Stalingrad, in the bunkers of Normandy, in the desperate house-to-house fighting across a collapsing Reich, the folding shovel became a weapon of terrible efficiency. It was silent, it was always accessible, and in the hands of a desperate or fanatical soldier, it was devastating. The blade could strike with the force of an axe, the edge could slash, the point could thrust. Soviet soldiers had learned this first in the ruins of urban warfare, where ammunition ran low and fighting became primitive. Later, American and British troops would encounter the same brutal reality, often in the dark, often too late. American soldiers expected engineering problems. They expected to dig. They carried their new folding shovels with the same practical mindset they carried canteens or mess kits, as equipment, not armament. The US Army's training manuals for the M1943 entrenching tool contained detailed instructions on excavation techniques, proper angles for foxholes, and maintenance procedures. There were diagrams showing the correct body mechanics for efficient digging, calculations of how long it should take to create fighting positions in various soil types, recommendations for drainage and reinforcement. What the manuals did not contain, what American training doctrine conspicuously avoided, was any mention of the tool as a weapon. This was not oversight. It reflected a fundamental difference in military philosophy and national character. The American military, vast and supplied beyond any previous army in history, did not expect its soldiers to resort to entrenching tools in combat. They had rifles, grenades, automatic weapons, artillery, air support, an overwhelming cascade of firepower that made hand-to-hand combat an aberration rather than an expectation. The shovel was for digging because American soldiers would dig in, wait for support, and let superior firepower solve their problems. The contrast was not merely tactical, it was ideological, rooted in two entirely different visions of what war demanded and what human beings must become to wage it. The reality came as a shock, delivered in darkness and blood across the forests, towns, and bunkers of occupied Europe. Lieutenant Robert Marsh, leading a patrol through a shattered Belgian village in December 1944, encountered a German soldier in the cellar of a bombed-out building. Both men's rifles were useless in the tight space, magazines empty, or weapons jammed with mud and cold. The German, an 18-year-old conscript, whose name Marsh would never learn, pulled the folding shovel from his belt with the practiced motion of someone who had trained for exactly this moment. The fight lasted perhaps 15 seconds, though Marsh would remember it in fragmented images for the rest of his life. The dim light, the sound of the blade cutting air, the desperate scramble for survival in a space too small for war, yet filled with it entirely. Marsh survived because another American soldier descended the stairs behind him, firing a pistol that echoed like cannon fire in the enclosed space. Later, sitting in the remains of what had once been a kitchen, Marsh examined the German's shovel. The blade was sharpened deliberately and carefully to an edge that had nothing to do with digging. He picked up his own entrenching tool, identical in design, and felt the dull blade. It was a tool. The German version had been something else. The reports came in from multiple fronts, in official after-action summaries and unofficial letters home, in the quiet conversations between veteran soldiers and the nightmares of men who had survived close-quarters encounters. In the Hürtgen forest, in the rubble of German cities, in the final desperate defenses of the Rhine, American troops encountered not just enemy soldiers but an enemy philosophy, a willingness to transform anything into a weapon, to blur all distinctions between the civilian and military, between tool and instrument of killing. The Klappspaten became symbolic of this difference, not because of any single dramatic incident, but because of its consistent, disturbing presence. GIs would find German positions where ammunition was exhausted, but the folding shovels remained, cleaned and sharpened, prepared for a final defense that accepted no boundary between soldier and savage. They found training materials, illustrated guides, showing strike zones and techniques that had nothing to do with entrenchment. They heard from prisoners of war who spoke of it casually as common knowledge that when bullets ran out, you still had the shovel. The American military did not officially acknowledge this intelligence, perhaps because it contradicted too sharply with their vision of modern civilized warfare, perhaps because acknowledging it would require difficult questions about what circumstances might force American soldiers to the same extremity. But the most profound evidence came not from combat reports, but from the weight of implications. The Germans had entered the war believing in swift victory, mechanized supremacy, racial ideology that promised them mastery over inferior peoples. They had designed their equipment, including the humble folding shovel, with the efficiency and precision that characterized German engineering. Yet by 1945, that same tool intended for the quick construction of temporary positions during a rapid advance had become an instrument of last resort brutality, wielded by starving teenagers in the ruins of their own cities, fighting for a cause already lost. The transformation was complete. The Klappspaten, like Germany itself, had begun as a symbol of modern military efficiency and ended as a relic of desperate, primitive violence. The Americans, copying the design in 1943 when German victory still seemed possible to some, could not foresee this trajectory. They saw the surface, the clever folding mechanism, the compact design, without perceiving the darkness underneath, the philosophical acceptance that war could strip away all civilization, reduce soldiers to something primal, turn every object into a weapon because nothing else remained. The recurring image, the symbol that haunted the consciousness of both armies, was not the shovel itself, but what soldiers did with it when the fighting stopped. American troops, after securing a position, would use their entrenching tools exactly as designed, digging latrines, preparing cooking fires, creating drainage ditches, burying the dead. The tool would be wiped clean, folded, returned to its carrier. It remained what it had been manufactured to be, separating cleanly between its function in war and its neutrality as an object. German soldiers, when circumstances allowed, would sharpen their Klappspaten before rest, sitting in foxholes and bunkers with whetstones, maintaining an edge that served no excavation purpose. This ritual, observed by Allied soldiers who captured positions intact, spoke to a different relationship with violence, not casual or eager, but grimly practical, an acceptance that readiness for killing must be continuous, that the boundary between peace and combat was too thin to allow for the luxury of specialized tools. The sharpening was preparation, yes, but it was also a kind of meditation, a physical acknowledgement that civilization's rules had been suspended, possibly forever. The transformation this forced on both armies was asymmetric. For Germans, the Klappspaten's evolution from tool to weapon mirrored their national trajectory. The descent from industrial might to rubble, from visions of empire to desperate defense of ruins, from soldiers to survivors. The shovel became symbolic of total war taken to its logical extreme, where every resource, every object, every person existed only for violence. The ideology of German supremacy, which had justified the war's beginning, corroded into something far darker by its end, not belief in victory, but simply habit of fighting, reflex rather than purpose. American soldiers, encountering this reality, found themselves confronted with questions their training had not prepared them to answer. If war could reduce an enemy to such extremity, what did that say about war itself? If a shovel could become a weapon of last resort, what other boundaries might collapse under sufficient pressure? The Americans had copied the German design, but they could not copy and did not want to learn the bitter experience that taught Germans to see weapons everywhere. The abundance of American supply lines served as both shield and blindfold. US forces never faced the systematic deprivation that forced Germans to such improvisations. When American units ran low on ammunition, supply trucks arrived, or airdrops delivered fresh ordnance. When positions needed defending, engineers brought barbed wire, sandbags, prefabricated bunkers. The entrenching tool remained a digging implement because American soldiers never reached the point of having nothing else. This was not moral superiority, it was logistical fortune, the product of oceans that protected American factories from bombardment, of an industrial capacity that could produce overwhelming material surplus. Yet this abundance created its own kind of ignorance. American military planners, examining the Klappspaten in 1943, saw what they wanted to see: efficient German engineering to be replicated. They did not see the desperation beneath the efficiency, the unspoken acknowledgement that German soldiers would eventually have nothing but steel and will. The Americans copied the shovel but missed the prophecy it contained. By the war's end, as American troops occupied German positions and processed hundreds of thousands of prisoners, the folding shovel had become a minor historical footnote lost among the overwhelming evidence of greater horrors, the camps, the cities reduced to ash, the millions dead. Yet for the soldiers who had encountered that sharpened blade in the darkness, who had fought men wielding shovels with the desperation of the doomed, the object retained a strange power. It appeared in nightmares, in the involuntary memories that ambush veterans decades after the fighting stops. Not because it was more terrible than bullets or bombs, but because it represented something more intimate and therefore more disturbing. The reduction of warfare to its primitive essence, human beings killing each other with whatever came to hand, all ideology and cause burning away until only violence remained, pure and purposeless. The epilogue writes itself in the objects left behind. Across Europe, in museums and private collections, both versions of the folding shovel sit in display cases, often side by side. The American M1943 entrenching tool, its blade still dull, its metal clean. The German Klappspaten, many of them still bearing sharpened edges, some with stains that curators politely decline to explain. They look nearly identical, these tools, products of the same observation, the same industrial logic. Yet they tell divergent stories. One speaks to abundance, to an army that could afford to let tools remain tools, that never faced such deprivation that shovels must become weapons. The other speaks to the terrible adaptability of human beings under pressure, to the collapse of boundaries between civilization and savagery, to the truth that ideology, whether Nazi supremacy or American democracy, ultimately matters less than logistics, supply lines, and the basic question of whether a soldier has bullets left or only sharpened steel. The Americans copied Germany's folding shovel with precision and thoroughness, but they could not copy, and perhaps should feel grateful they never learned, what desperation teaches about the distance between a tool and a weapon, which turns out to be nothing but intention, and intention becomes fluid when survival hangs in the balance of what you carry in your hand.